My assignment this evening was to address an apologetic issue. And I want to do that. But what I want to do is, there are a number of ways that we can tackle apologetics. On the one hand, we can tackle apologetics from the standpoint of, first let me back up and do this. When we talk about apologetics, we talk about knowing what we believe, knowing why we believe it, and being able to communicate that to others in a winsome fashion. That's the simplest definition I can give you of apologetics. It doesn't mean apologizing for anything. An apology is a defense. It comes from the Greek word apologia. We find that word in Peter's epistles, where Peter says that we are always to be ready to give a defense, to give an answer to anyone who asks us the reason for the hope that is in us. The word that he uses there is apologia. It's a reasoned response. It's a defense of what it is that we believe. So we have to know what we believe. We have to know why we believe it. And we have to be able to communicate that. And we have to be able to communicate it in a winsome fashion. One way we can deal with that is through dealing with the major issues of apologetics. If somebody's asking us what we believe and why we believe it, they're asking us about usually cardinal Christian doctrines. And so as a result of that, since our faith is a biblical faith, it's limited in its scope. There are about 7 or 8 categories, maybe 9 categories of questions that people will ever ask in an apologetic setting. And if you're familiar with these, 7, 8, maybe 9 categories, you can answer questions all day, every day from anyone, anywhere. Why? Because there's a limited amount of claims that we make as Christians, which means there are a limited amount of questions that will come our way. And people are going to ask us, about the existence of God. They're going to ask us about creation. They're going to ask us about the nature of God. A question about the Trinity. They're going to ask us about Christ. They're going to ask us, about the exclusivity of Christ. They're going to ask us about the resurrection of Christ. People are going to ask us about the problem of evil and suffering. They're going to ask us about the Bible and the authenticity and historicity of the Bible. Again, just a very limited number of categories. Within those categories, people will be creative, but just those limited number of categories. That's one approach to apologetics, and it's probably our most familiar approach to apologetics, dealing with those categories. But there is another approach to apologetics, and that is based on what's called our meta-narrative, or our overarching story. It is our explanation for why things are the way they are. And this is a very compelling way to approach apologetics, because ultimately people reason from their worldview. People look at the world through a particular lens, and they understand everything through that particular lens. So when they're dealing with these various issues, they are dealing with these issues through the lens of their worldview. If their worldview is not biblical, it is inconsistent and it is inferior. Okay? Now, I don't say that to be arrogant. I say that because I believe in God, and I believe that God has revealed himself in his word. Therefore, if God is real, and if God has revealed himself in his word, then any worldview that is not based upon that will be inconsistent and it will be inferior. Fair enough? Okay? So if we understand this, then we know that people are going to have inconsistencies in their worldview. And ultimately what's going to have to happen because of their inconsistencies and because of the inferior nature of their worldview, they are going to have to borrow from, well, they don't plan to give it back. They're going to have to steal from the biblical worldview, okay? For example, people will say, there's some issue that people, are up in arms about, and they'll talk about the way people, ought to be treated, and they'll talk about how we ought to be, kind to one another, or we ought to take care of the poor, or we ought to do this, or we ought to do that. Generally speaking, those are things that they stole from the Christian worldview. So they don't want to accept Christianity, but they want to make arguments based on the Christian worldview. So in order to do this kind of apologetics, oftentimes what we do is we end up telling our meta-narrative, or our overarching story as it is applied to particular issues.